but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father rants.
There is a particular kind of education that no film school can provide. It cannot be taught in the classroom, it cannot be learned from a textbook, and it most certainly cannot be absorbed by watching someone else go through it from a safe distance. It is the education of survival, the kind that only comes from standing in a room with a legend who makes the air feel thin, or sitting across a table from a genius whose brilliance is indistinguishable from cruelty. Robert Duvall has had that education. He has had it, in abundance, and unlike many of his generation who quietly absorbed their wounds and never spoke of them, Duvall in interviews, memoirs, and candid conversations over the decades has offered the world a rare and unfiltered window into what it truly felt like to navigate Hollywood when the stakes were highest, the egos were largest, and the rules were written by whoever had the most power in the room. Duvall's career spans more than 6 decades. He has played criminals and presidents, cowboys and priests, generals and drifters. He has earned Academy Award nominations that stretch across multiple decades and won the Oscar for Best Actor for Tender Mercies in 1984. He has worked with Francis Ford Coppola, Apocalypse Now, True Grit, and To Kill a Mockingbird. He has been, by every reasonable measure, one of the most consistently excellent actors that American cinema has ever produced. But behind that resume is a man who encountered some of the most difficult, most volatile, most psychologically complicated personalities that Hollywood has ever assembled under a single roof. These were not just difficult colleagues. These were forces of nature, people whose talent was matched only by their capacity to make everyone around them miserable, or at the very least, deeply uncomfortable. What makes Duvall's perspective so valuable is that he approaches these stories not with bitterness, but with the detached precision of a craftsman examining the flaws in another craftsman's work. He does not hate these people. He respects many of them, even the ones who made his professional life genuinely difficult. But he does not pretend that the path was smooth. He does not perform gratitude for experiences that were, at their core, damaging. He tells the truth, and the truth, as Duvall has lived it, is that Hollywood's golden age was populated by people whose genius and whose darkness were often drawn from exactly the same well. These are the 6 actors who tested Robert Duvall's patience, his character, and his understanding of what it means to pursue greatness without losing your soul in the process. If you ask anyone who has ever worked in serious American cinema to name the single most towering influence on the craft of screen acting, the answer is almost always the same name: Marlon Brando. And if you ask those same people what it was actually like to work alongside that influence, the temperature in the room tends to drop considerably. Robert Duvall first crossed paths with Brando's world in the most significant way possible, sharing the screen in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather in 1972, where Duvall played Tom Hagen, the cool and calculating consigliere to Brando's Vito Corleone. It should have been the professional partnership of a lifetime. In many ways it was. But the reality of working in the gravitational field of Marlon Brando was something that tested even a disciplined, methodically prepared actor like Robert Duvall. Brando's genius was never in question. What was in question, every single day, on every set he ever occupied, was whether that genius would bother to show up on time, know its lines, and cooperate with the basic organizational requirements of a major film production. Brando had developed, by the early 1970s, a legendary and deeply disruptive habit of refusing to memorize his dialogue. He relied instead on cue cards, on assistants holding prompts just off camera, on scraps of paper taped to his fellow actors' chests or foreheads. For an actor like Duvall, who believed in preparation the way a soldier believes in his rifle, this was not merely an inconvenience, it was an affront to the craft itself. Duvall came from the school of acting rooted in discipline and instinct, working in harmony. Brando's method, if you could call it that in its later form, was to replace preparation with improvisation and call it art. The deeper issue, however, was not the cue cards. It was the atmosphere that Brando's behavior created around him. When a man of his stature decides that the rules do not apply to him, everyone else in the room has to compensate. Schedules collapsed. Other actors had to hold their emotional performances in a state of readiness for hours, while Brando's rituals were accommodated. The production bent itself around one man's refusal to operate within a shared framework. Duvall watched this, absorbed it, and drew from it a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. Greatness, he concluded, does not grant the license to disrespect the people standing next to you. Brando was the first and most overwhelming proof of that principle. If Brando's chaos was slow-moving and psychological, Frank Sinatra's was immediate, physical, and entirely non-negotiable. Sinatra operated by a philosophy that was simple, absolute, and completely incompatible with the collaborative spirit of serious filmmaking. He believed in the first take, not because he was unprepared, not because he was careless, but because he believed, with the evangelical conviction of a man who had built an empire on instinct, that the first take contained an energy that could never be recaptured. Everything after the first take, in Sinatra's worldview, was a lie. It was a performance of a performance, and Frank Sinatra was not interested in performing lies. For actors who shared scenes with Sinatra, this philosophy was a form of professional terrorism. The first take is, by definition, the take where the camera might not be properly positioned, where the lighting has not been fully refined, where your fellow actor may still be finding the emotional key to the scene. When Sinatra delivered his best, most spontaneous, most electrically alive performance on the first take, and then refused to repeat it with genuine investment, everyone around him was left with a choice. Either match him instantly, perfectly, and completely on that first unrepeatable attempt, or accept that their performance in the final cut would be measured against a man who was fully present only once. Duvall has spoken about this culture of first-take tyranny with the careful language of someone who understood its origins without accepting its consequences. Sinatra was not being difficult out of laziness. He was being difficult out of a deeply held artistic belief, but the effect on the set was the same regardless of the motivation. It created an atmosphere of pressure so concentrated that it functioned less like inspiration and more like threat. Duvall learned from observing this dynamic that an actor's personal philosophy, however sincerely held, becomes a form of aggression the moment it overrides the needs of everyone else in the room. George C. Scott was, by nearly universal agreement among those who worked with him, one of the most purely talented actors of the 20th century. He was also one of the most combative, most argumentative, and most exhausting personalities that the American film industry ever produced. Scott approached every role, every scene, and every directorial suggestion as an intellectual battlefield. He did not simply disagree with people. He demolished their arguments with the systematic precision of a trial lawyer, and then rebuilt the scene according to his own vision, which was frequently brilliant and almost always arrived at through a process that left casualties in its wake. For Duvall, whose own approach to acting was deeply personal and internally driven, Scott represented a fascinating and deeply uncomfortable mirror. Both men were serious. Both men were committed to truth over comfort. But where Duvall carried his intensity quietly, burning hot on the inside while maintaining a professional exterior, Scott wore his conflict openly, loudly, and with apparent relish. Scott seemed to believe that the best work emerged from argument, from the grinding collision of competing visions, until something genuinely new and unexpected was forced into existence. Duvall has described witnessing this process with the ambivalence of someone who could see the method's logic while suffering its side effects. Scott was right often enough to justify his reputation, but the cost of being right in Scott's manner was paid by everyone around him, in tension, in delayed schedules, in the quiet dread that came with knowing the day's first disagreement was only a warm-up for what came next. What Scott ultimately represented in Duvall's professional education was the danger of weaponizing intelligence. Talent and intellect in Scott's hands were not merely tools for creating better performances. They were instruments of control. He used them to establish dominance over every creative space he entered, and while the results were sometimes extraordinary, The process was a reminder that there is a thin and frequently crossed line between holding your ground as an artist and simply refusing to share the room. Of all the actors who shaped the new Hollywood era alongside Robert Duvall, none embodied the double-edged nature of total commitment quite like Dustin Hoffman. Hoffman was, and remains, a performer of almost supernatural dedication. He was the kind of actor who would starve himself, sleep, deprive himself, physically transform himself, and emotionally excavate himself to levels that most human beings would consider psychologically dangerous, all in the service of a performance that he believed needed to be not just good, not just excellent, but absolutely and irreducibly true. This commitment produced some of the most remarkable screen performances of the 20th century. It also made him, on certain sets and in certain circumstances, very nearly impossible to work alongside. Duvall's encounters with Hoffman's process, both direct and through the broader industry conversation of their shared era, illustrated a fundamental tension that runs through the heart of serious acting. At what point does one actor's commitment to their own truth begin to trespass on another actor's ability to find theirs? Hoffman's methods were not designed to harm his colleagues, but they frequently did, because they operated from the assumption that the emotional reality being constructed on screen was, above all else, his emotional reality. The scene existed to serve his performance. The other actors in the scene were, in some functional sense, instruments in that service. Duvall, who believed deeply in the reciprocal, listening-based nature of screen acting, found this approach to be a kind of professional solipsism dressed in the language of artistic integrity. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal in its details but true in its essence, of Hoffman arriving on set visibly exhausted after deliberately depriving himself of sleep to capture the emotional state of a character in crisis, and the director Laurence Olivier observing this and asking simply, "Have you tried acting?" Duvall's relationship with this anecdote is complex, because he understood Hoffman's impulse even as he recognized its excesses. The lesson he drew from it was one of proportionality. Dedication to truth is not measured in suffering. It is measured in the quality of what finally appears on screen, and the question of what that quality cost the people who were not consulted about the price. Gene Hackman is perhaps the most paradoxical figure in Robert Duvall's professional galaxy. By most technical measures, Hackman should have been the easiest collaborator of Duvall's generation to work alongside. He was professional, he was prepared, he showed up on time, knew his lines, and delivered performances that were consistently among the finest of any era. He was not a diva in the conventional sense. He did not make excessive demands or create disruptions through ego or addiction or philosophical warfare. And yet, working with Hackman, as Duvall and many others have noted with careful understatement, carried its own particular form of tension, because beneath the professionalism, beneath the preparation, beneath the collegial surface of a man who appeared to be playing by all the rules, there was something volcanic, something that could, without much visible warning, erupt. Hackman's volatility was not performative, it was constitutional. He was a man who carried within him an intensity so compressed and so pressurized that the people around him were always, on some level, aware that the ground beneath them was not entirely stable. Directors walked carefully. CO stars measured their words. There was a general and largely unspoken understanding on sets where Hackman worked that the atmosphere was subject to change without notice. Duvall, who himself was no stranger to quiet intensity, recognized in Hackman a kindred fire, but one that was less controlled, less directed, and therefore more unpredictable in its consequences. What Hackman represented in Duvall's education was the lesson of the smoldering professional. Not all difficult behavior announces itself loudly. Some of the most challenging presences on a film set are the ones who appear normal right up until the moment they do not. The reluctant volcano, as Duvall understood it, is in some ways harder to navigate than the open tyrant, because you cannot anticipate it, cannot prepare for it, and cannot negotiate with it in advance. You can only stand your ground when the moment arrives and hope that your own equilibrium is stronger than the eruption. If there is a single archetype in Hollywood history that has generated more wasted time, more exhausted crews, more derailed schedules, and more quiet professional despair than any other, it is the archetype of the brilliant, beautiful, and utterly indecisive perfectionist. And in the firmament of that particular archetype, Warren Beatty burns with a light that is entirely his own. Beatty was, across the span of his most active decades as a producer, director, and leading man, a figure of almost mythological capability. He was also, by the testimony of nearly everyone who worked within his orbit, a man for whom the finality of a decision was something close to a personal catastrophe. For Duvall, who operated with the efficiency and conviction of someone who believed that a clear choice clearly made was always superior to a perfect choice, infinitely delayed, Beatty represented the Hollywood system's most indulgent tendency taken to its logical extreme. Beatty could spend hours, days, or in famous cases, weeks, debating a choice that by any rational professional standard had a perfectly acceptable answer. Lighting, camera angles, line readings, the precise arrangement of a scene's physical geography. All of these were subjects of potentially endless re-examination, and because Beatty, when he finally made a decision, was frequently correct, the system accommodated him. The industry learned to wait for Warren, and in waiting for Warren, the industry reinforced the behavior that made waiting for Warren such a reliable feature of any production he touched. What Duvall absorbed from this was perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of all, because it implicated not just the difficult individual, but the entire ecosystem that enabled and rewarded them. Hollywood creates the monsters it then complains about. When the industry learns that a difficult temperament produces a successful film, it writes that temperament a blank check. Beatty was not uniquely indecisive. He was indecisive in a context that had decided, a long time ago, that his indecision was worth the price. Duvall recognized this with the clear eyes of a man who had never been offered that particular blank check, and therefore had never been tempted to spend it. He understood that the greatest protection against becoming what Beatty represented was not talent, or discipline, or even character. It was the absence of a system willing to tolerate you at your worst indefinitely. Robert Duvall emerged from 6 decades of professional encounters with some of the most combustible personalities in the history of American cinema, with something that most of his contemporaries did not manage to hold on to. He emerged with his integrity completely intact, not untouched. No one who has truly lived inside this industry is untouched, but intact, whole, recognizably, and consistently himself. The 6 figures examined in this account were not villains. They were not simple people. They were, each of them, complex human beings whose difficulties were usually inseparable from their gifts, whose worst professional behaviors were frequently the shadow cast by their most remarkable talents. Brando's chaos was the flip side of his transcendence. Sinatra's tyranny of the first take was rooted in a genuine and defensible artistic philosophy. Scott's intellectual warfare produced results that the less combative could not have achieved. Hoffman's siege of perfectionism gave the world performances that will outlast everyone who suffered to produce them. Hackman's volatility was the pressure valve of an intensity that also made him great, and Beatty's indecision was the price of a vision so comprehensive it could never be entirely satisfied. What Duvall learned from all of them, collectively, was not bitterness. It was clarity. He learned where his own lines were drawn. He learned what he was willing to absorb in the name of the work, and what he was not. He learned that the word professional is not merely a description of employment status, but a daily ethical commitment to the people sharing the room with you. He learned that talent is not a get-out-of-consequences card, and he learned, perhaps most valuably of all, that the actors who endure are not necessarily the loudest, or the most volatile, or the most celebrated in their moment. They are the ones who keep showing up, prepared, and present, and clear-eyed, long after the emperors and the volcanoes and the sovereigns of indecision have exhausted everyone, including themselves. Robert Duvall is still here. That more than any Oscar or any legendary performance is the truest measure of what he survived, what he learned, and who he chose to become.